Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we return to one of the major themes that have characterized how Humanity Rising has oriented its content since its beginning, and that is the environment and the ongoing degradation of the planetary ecosystem due to global warming and climate change. Before we dive into that very complex domain, I want to just express my appreciation again for all of you who have been contributing to our fundraising campaign. More and more people have signed up and contributed. It's a wonderful thing to feel the level of your care and support for what it is that we're doing, because for the last 3 years plus, this has been really a free public service on the part of Ubiquity University and the 350 partners that have come together around our daily broadcast of Humanity Rising. And as we have extended our brand, as it were, and our name recognition, more and more people have Ben, you might turn off your video and put yourself on mute until you're introduced. Thank you. So we're very appreciative. And I'll put the link in the chat box for those of you who would like to join our group of financial supporters, because it's enabling us to continue to grow and to continue to expand. And over the next weeks and months, I'll be bringing to people's attention some of the areas of our expansion and growth. It's very, very dynamic. Principally, as I've mentioned, is around our extraterrestrial studies program. We had an amazing call yesterday with people that are interested in joining the program. Partnerships at all kinds of levels are continuing to really pour into Ubiquity as we maintain the highest academic standards, but with a pursuit of wisdom and truth, beauty, and goodness that is rooted not in modernity, but in the ancient understandings of the integration of our world with the larger cosmos. So thank you. We want to now turn to a very specific area of the world, the Great Salt Lake, if you know that, in the state of Utah. One of what they call terminal lakes. Many of you have probably known about the Dead Sea in Palestine. That's a lake that is very famous in biblical and Middle Eastern history. And similarly, in the United States, there is the Great Salt Lake. Turns out about half of the lakes in the world are what they call terminal lakes, where water flows in, but it doesn't flow out. And most of those, like so much of the rest of the environment, are under siege, largely because of overpopulation and human use, but also as the ecosystem begins to deteriorate rapidly, with all kinds of tipping points being traversed. We are now in multiple code red issues and challenges with regards to the environment. And the Great Salt Lake is one of those. So today we're going to focus on this one little microcosm, which exemplifies the challenges that we're facing globally, and talk with people who are struggling mightily to be able to salvage the situation and maintain a balanced and harmonious ecosystem in that part of the United States. To introduce our program, I'd like to welcome back Bob Reese, who you all know. who is a professor of Mormon studies at the Graduate Theological Union, with a deep academic and intellectual experience, multiple articles and books to his credit. And he's been a regular contributor and convener to Humanity Rising. So Bob, thank you so much for your ongoing support and your intellectual curiosity. You brought together a diversity of panels and subject matters that is rare among our regular contributors. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for it and turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be on Humanity Rising's Global Solutions Summit again. People who know me know that I'm interested in just about everything. And so when I have an opportunity, as this program offers, to share my passions with others, I'm very, very pleased with that. And I'm particularly pleased today. I first, believe it or not, I first saw Great Salt Lake 70 years ago when I was a freshman student at BYU. This was when BYU had 5,000 students instead of the 35,000 or so they have today. But the Great Salt Lake, as we called it, had lived in my imagination until I was actually able to see it. So I have been fascinated with it since then, and have been particularly alert to its shrinkage, to the number of living creatures whose existence depends on the lake. And I'm just very pleased today to have this distinguished panel. Ben Abbott is not only one of my heroes, he's a hero to a lot of people in Utah for the great work that he's done, not only in teaching students at BYU, but in his inspired activism within the greater Salt Lake environment. And Ben has brought some colleagues that he's working with here. And so Ben, I'm going to turn this over to you. One of the things that I did yesterday was to look at a map to see how large Great Salt Lake was in its past. I think 20 to 30,000 square miles, as I recall. And now to think of where it is and where it could be is something that I feel everyone should be interested in because of what it represents to the global ecology. And so it's with a pleasure that I turn you over to this and your colleagues.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Jim, for the invitation. Really happy to be here today, and I'd love to invite all the panelists to join. The opportunity to tell this story to a larger audience is really a privilege, and I think that we all agree that this is microcosm maybe makes it too small. We'll call it a mesocosm of a lot of the challenges that we're facing, as a species and as a global community of human and non-human beings. And I'd love to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe we'll start with you, Carly, and then go over to Darren.
Hi, I'm Carly Beadle. I'm the coordinator for Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster University here in Salt Lake City. And I mentor our students in doing research on Great Salt Lake. And I also do research on the brine flies that live here and their importance in the ecosystem.
Thanks, Carly.
Hi, I'm Darren Perry, former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. Currently today, I teach full-time at the University of Utah, teaching the Environmental Humanities Department. And since our creation story started at Antelope Island, and I've been going there as a young boy with a grandmother that called the lake our grandmother water. It's vitally important to me. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Darren. Tim, Sarah, and Chandler.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Davis. I'm the Deputy Great Salt Lake Commissioner. The state of Utah created the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office in 2023 to develop a strategic plan for the Great Salt Lake to get the lake to a healthy range and be able to sustain it there. And I have the good privilege of living and breathing that plan. And I will have to step out a little early today, but I appreciate you being here. And thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Tim.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Sarah Knoll. I'm a professor of watershed sciences at Utah State University. I work on environmental water management, so trying to think about how to get water to our natural places and what sort of trade-offs there'll be for people. And so I do research about what our future options are for the lake.
Thanks, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chandler Rosenberg. I am an activist and community organizer. Originally started in the food and kind of food system agriculture space. And then after hearing about Great Salt Lake and really seeing it as like the defining climate action opportunity of our time, moved over to Great Salt Lake work, started a group called Save Our Great Salt Lake. And most recently was working as deputy director of the Great Basin Water Network, but I'm currently transitioning back to focus more on the lake. So excited to be here.
Thanks, Chandler, and thank you, everyone. We wanted to have a very frank and open discussion today, thinking about the lake's importance, its current status, and future. And I'd love to start out with that question about what is Great Salt Lake and why does it matter to you? This could be culturally, ecologically, hydrologically, and any dimension. For those, since this audience mainly isn't from the Intermountain West, what is this lake and why are we here?
I've turned off my.
Well, I can take a stab at that first. So I am kind of a hydrologist by training, a geographer and hydrologist by training. And to me, Great Salt Lake is a beacon of change. So when Great Salt Lake is doing poorly and is in decline, then that shows that we're not managing our water resources very sustainably. And also, the lake is really important. The lake and people are tied up together. So if we lose the lake, we're losing, some of the health of our system, whether it's from water, water problems or dust problems, but the two really go together. You can't think about the lake and separate it from people.
Really build off of what Sarah said. The Great Salt Lake, in Utah, the Great Salt Lake is essential to our communities, the ecology, and our economy. It's kind of a nexus of those three. It reached its lowest recorded level in 2022 and really put all three of those at risk. Both, as Sarah mentioned, dust, potentially from the lake that is liberated from the playa, the dry playa of the lake, potentially impacting the communities around the lake. Carly can talk to the brine flies, but the ecosystem showed signs that it was beginning to collapse because of low lake levels and high salinity. And then there's a large, as well as the 10 to 12 million birds that rely upon brine flies, brine shrimp that live in the lake. And there's a whole economy that also is dependent upon the lake, including brine shrimp fishery, but also the economy, 2.8 million people who live near the lake, and really many of them downwind of the lake. So it's a critical piece of, and it's just archetypal as well as a culturally important, as Darren said, to the people who've lived here and who do live here. It's hard to imagine Utah without a Great Salt Lake and a healthy Great Salt Lake.
Hey, Ben, can I just say from a Native American perspective, our creation story started at the lake, first of all. And I remember as a young boy going on plant walks around the lake and out on Antelope Island with a grandmother who identified plants that were used as a food source or a medicine. Before we left the lake, she would always sing an honor song to the lake. healing song. And so I grew up looking at this, and she always called the rocks and plants and water our non-human kinfolk. Well, that kinfolk to me just meant my relationship to what we look at as the natural environment that we live in. To me, it was a relative, and we love our relatives and we take care of them. So I don't look at it. I was lucky enough to listen to Robin Wall Kimmerer last night at a lecture, and she talked about this gift economy versus a market economy. And, Native Americans look at the lake as a gift economy. And so we don't live in that space anymore. And what we live in is a market economy. How can we make $1 off this resource? And that's what's got us into the problems we're in today as we divert more water for more development. We've taken away the lifeblood of Grandmother Lake is what I have always referred to her as. So it's just a different way of looking at land, at water, at resources, from the way my people looked at it versus the way we look at it today. And I realize that we live in today's world. We're not getting rid of this capitalistic system, but I think there's steps that we can take going forward that can minimize the impact and really help save the lake for a million reasons and be better stewards as we go forward.
Thanks to all of you. Yeah, go ahead, Chandler.
Build off what Darren was saying. I grew up in the dominant culture here in Salt Lake City, and I think it's important to underscore that many people in Utah did not grow up with a relationship with Great Salt Lake. There's this idea here that it's a stinky place. There are a lot of bugs. It's hard to love. And so I really didn't have a relationship with the lake, although I was here my whole life until starting this work. Like my first memory out at the lake, I remember somebody asking, where do we get in and swim? And I was like, actually, we don't swim here. You must not be from here, So I think it's really interesting to see this shift and kind of this place that we're in now, where we are starting to realize. I see the lake as kind of this microcosm, as Jim said, of our larger relationship to nature, and this issue and the work that we're all doing is kind of calling us back, which I think is really interesting.
Thank you, Chandler. Thank you, everyone, for that view of the importance of the lake. I wondered, would anybody be willing to talk about the lake's global significance? How it fits into the Earth system generally, and how somebody from Argentina or Germany or Chad might care about what's going on here. Any thoughts on that?
I can take a first crack, and then Sarah can correct anything that I say wrong. So I would put it in. I brought up you brought up Argentina, Ben, and just there is an amazing migratory bird pathway that the lake is a key hub for. And there's 10 to 12 million birds that utilize the lake, that rely upon it. But I think also in a global context is, we're in Utah, and the work that we're doing for the lake, we're acutely aware that saline lakes are in decline across the world, and that there hasn't been a successful major saline lake that has been recovered once it's begun to decline. And so we are working hard to ensure that doesn't happen. And if we can figure out how to find that balance, then hopefully that can set an example for other saline lakes across the world. Sarah, what did I get wrong?
Well, I'll add a little bit, and then hopefully Carly and some others can jump into the ecologists. I'd say just really the importance that and you've touched on this, that this lake has a global importance, because the species that visit Great Salt Lake might also go to other terminal lakes and wetlands around the world. So if Great Salt Lake were to crash, it really could have large repercussions ecologically that affect species in other countries and the health of those ecosystems in other places. And so because of that, this lake is more important than just a lake in Utah. It has this really global connection, and we have to remember that. Carly, jump in with anything that I didn't say.
Well, I mean, when I think of this and kind of in terms of like what you and Tim already had talked about, that we've seen these other saline lakes in decline. And so we're kind of in this, like, what's going to happen zone. It can go either way. We're in that like tipping point, I guess. And so it's kind of like we're in this setting an example kind of, I don't know the word, but like it's not up to us, but because so many lakes have not been successful when they've reached this point, can we be the ones to do that? And then, I study the flies, which so many people are like, they're not that cool. Why do we care? But I obviously love them. I have some in my office. But these are also species that just the way that they function and are able to live in this saline environment is really amazing in an ecological perspective. And it can kind of help understand different environments in different places as well, because it is such a unique ecosystem that is here.
Wow. So a lake of global importance, the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere, connected in many ways, biologically and hydrologically, with a big portion of the Earth system, and also a lake at a tipping point or crossroads, right, where we're trying to pioneer a new path to saline lake stewardship, something that hasn't been done anywhere in the world. I wonder, what is the current situation, right? How bad is it? How much of the lake is gone? We've already spoke some about what happens if we lose the lake, but could somebody give us a status report? What is the health of the lake?
So I was out on the lake yesterday and went from Antelope Island. Darren mentioned Antelope Island earlier, over to Fremont Island and back. The good news is there was a lot of water in that passage, but the lake has come up 6 feet from its lowest recorded level in 2022, but it is still 3.5 feet below the minimum healthy range that the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's office set for the lake in earlier this year. So while we've made progress, we've had 2 big water years, and snowpack right now is about 130% of normal for this time of year within the Great Salt Lake Basin. So we're hopeful it'll continue to come up and runoff from the mountains. And just so everyone knows, the Great Salt Lake Basin and the lake is very dependent upon snowpack and runoff from the snowpack. That is by far the largest source of precipitation and the flows that come into the lake. So we've made progress, but the lake typically rises and falls 2.5 feet on a normal year. And we were in a structural imbalance leading over around 20 years of drought. And the last estimate the last information I've gotten from Dr. Kevin Perry at the University of Utah is that he anticipates that the mega drought that we're in will begin again, that we're only in the middle of it, and that these last 2 years have been a reprieve, but not the end of that mega drought that we're currently in. So there's a lot of work we need to do to conserve additional water, to make sure it gets to shepherd it and make sure it gets to the lake, to overcome that structural imbalance that led the lake to get to its lowest level in 2022.
And in terms of how salty it is, so right now the south arm of the lake is around 12% salinity. And to put that in context, the ocean is 3.5%. So much, much saltier. And in, that 2022, when we were at the all-time low with less water, the salt still stays in there. Water evaporates, the salt stays, and it got up to about 19% salt salinity. And so the creatures that live in the lake, which are brine shrimp and brine fly larvae, they can only filter out so much salt, and when it gets saltier, then they can't reproduce, they can't survive, they can't grow. And so right now we're kind of at that, if it gets saltier, then we're in that danger zone, but we're still kind of we say it's like kind of in the orange right there. We want it to be less salty, but they're able to live. So we're seeing populations of the flies growing and coming back that they were almost gone a couple of years ago. So we're seeing those populations come back a bunch, but as Tim was saying, we're still not where we need to be. Yeah, and I see someone in the chat is saying Dead Sea is about 30%. I believe it's like 34%. It's just about at saturation, which is what our north arm of Great Salt Lake is as well.
One more important point with how the lake is doing is the lake is divided by a railroad trestle that basically makes a southern portion of the lake, which has fresher water, it's less saline, has higher lake levels, and a northern portion of the lake that is very, very salty. Right now, it would definitely be in the red zone. We have built a berm across an opening to basically try to hydrologically separate that northern portion from the southern portion. So in these wet years, the southern portion has gotten a good amount of water. The salinity has gone down somewhat. As Carly just said, it's not really in the green zone where we would like it to be. But we've really blocked off the water to half of the lake to try to restore or try to sustain one portion of the lake. And hopefully that will be reopened and we'll get to a place where we could take that berm out, but we're not there yet.
Thank you very much for that assessment. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how we got here, and we could split this into two components, right? Like what are the actions, what are the trends that have caused the lake to decline so much? If we're thinking about the physical causes of the lake decline. And then the second part might be, what does this say about us culturally? What led to those behaviors if we try to dig a little bit deeper? Anybody want to take a stab at either of those?
I'll take a stab. This is something I think about a lot. So of course we could point to, what got us here, too much water being diverted from the tributaries that flow into the lake. But I like to kind of go higher. And I think what Ben's getting at is in Utah, we haven't really seemed to have accepted that we live in a desert in a lot of ways. So we're the second driest state in the nation. We've got some of the highest municipal water rates in the country, green lawns everywhere you look. So really, I think just this idea that we don't have to live within the bioregional limitations of where we are. This is a very arid climate, and we're kind of acting like, we can, the pioneers who first settled here came from the east where there was much more water. And the idea was, let's just grow and irrigate and see the desert flourish without any sense of the consequences or the climate realities that we see now. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now and let someone else chime in. But I think that understanding of place, or perhaps lack of understanding of place, is really critical.
I'll jump in there a little bit and then everyone else can add on or correct me as needed. The diversions from the rivers are important, but I think what's really important is how much of that water is used or consumed and will never return back into the watershed. And that's important because sometimes when we divert water, if we have, like with flood irrigation, a lot of that water might eventually return to the lake. And in increasing our water use efficiency, and that's just a big fancy term for how much of that water we use that's diverted. And we've been pretty good at doing that with cities, with agriculture, really with everything. And that's meaning that less water gets to the lake. And so it's a tricky problem because everyone wants to point a finger, right, and say, well, that group is the problem. But really, I think of Great Salt Lake as being kind of death from 1,000 cuts. And so, and that makes it hard because then we also need these multi-pronged solutions to say, cities are going to use less water, and then that's going to enable future growth because we know that growth is coming. And agriculture can use less water, and that water we have to really make sure it comes to the lake. And there's been some big changes in that historically until 2020. Legally, the water that got to the Great Salt Lake was considered wasted. So if anybody else wanted to claim that water, they could. And our legislature changed our water code. And so now the water that gets to Great Salt Lake is a beneficial use. We still have troubles measuring that water because that's not where our stream gauges are, because we have this historical system, but we have some really promising directions that the legislature and the folks in Utah have done that at least create a promise for a solution out of this. And now Tim or anyone can jump into what I said.
So, no, Sarah, Chandler, you both hit on important pieces. I mean, one of the things that the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office was directed to do is to develop a strategic plan for just that. How do we get the lake back to a healthy level and sustain it there? What will those tasks be? We laid out basically a 30-year plan. It's taken us decades to get here. It'll take us a long time to get the lake back to a healthy range and sustain it. I mean, one of the things that we are working on right now is a detailed plan. How much water on average, we need to get to the lake each year above what we has been getting to the lake. So how much do we have to conserve? And then Ben, you'll appreciate this because you've heard my mantra before. How much do we have to conserve, dedicate to the lake, and deliver to the lake each year over 30 years in order to be able to get it back to that healthy level and sustain it? And then the key is, how do we then make sure that conservation happens and that water is then shepherded and measured and gets to the lake, and then we can measure the impact that it has on the lake. So we're actively working with Utah State, with University of Utah agencies, state and federal, on that more detailed plan right now. We committed to having it out by January, and we'll be working with water users from across the basin to ask them, when we have that target amount each year, what they need in order to be able to conserve, dedicate, and deliver that much water to the lake. And the legislature in Utah has made significant investments on the order of $250 million for agricultural optimization to make it more efficient when it comes to water. What else do we need, whether it's funding or legislation or policy, in order to be able to get that additional conservation to the lake?
So thank you for all this context. I'm hearing three main drivers: water use, but also climate change and drought have been mentioned. And I wondered, could somebody help us understand, because this is a complex issue, how are those three cuts, Sarah, to use your analogy, how are those interacting? What's their relative importance?
It's cool. Oh, go ahead, Carly.
Well, I believe that it's I want to say like 70% of the water used is human use, and then like 10-ish% is due to climate change, and then the rest or consumptive use, 70% consumptive use. There we go. And then 10-ish climate change, and then 10-ish kind of our environment-ish. So kind of approximate numbers there.
But the big chunk, right, is the human water use piece, followed by climate change as things get hotter, evaporation and transpiration rates increase. runoff decreases, and then the weather variability, things like the mega drought contributing to that. And that is an important context to have, I think, as we're trying to figure out how much of this can we actually control here in the watershed, how much of it has to be addressed at a global scale. So coming back to there were several interesting legal and cultural contributors to that water. If we focus on the water overuse part, right? Of course, climate change is being caused by people, but at a global scale, the drought we don't have direct control over. But that water use piece we do. And we've heard a little bit about cultural expectations, right? For settlers that came in and didn't understand the native view and understanding of the system, legal barriers, actually discouraging water getting to the lake. Any other thoughts on what is making us use so much water?
Yeah, can I chime in here, Ben? Let me throw
Please.
an atomic bomb into the whole equation from an indigenous perspective. So I love science. So Carly and Sarah, I love absolute science and innovation. But science and innovation has gotten us where we're at today. I can make that argument all day long, and rightfully so. I mean, when Chandler said we live in the second driest state in the country, we've had to look at ways to save water, to optimize every amount of drop of water that's available for use, for development, for people. And now we're asking science to get us out of the problem. Does anybody else see a problem with that? And let me make this argument. It's not a science problem. It's a values problem. Think about the whole conversation we're having. And so last night at the Q&A with Robin Walthammer and Kyle White, we were asked to submit questions on the discussion, and I asked that. I said, "Can you speak? You know, when I talk about environmental issues as not being a science problem; they're a values problem. Can you speak to that?" And they both just lit up, and because that's what they really speak to. And I think we have all the science and technology that we need, but we need to start asking ourselves, just because there is that land over there that we could extract, deplete, destroy, develop, maybe we should start asking ourselves, should we? And if we do, at what cost is it going to come to future generations? We don't consider the cost of what it's going to do for our children and grandchildren. And we don't do it because we don't put a dollar cost on things that we should. Mm-hmm. So if we develop that piece of property over there, let's put a dollar cost on the air pollution it's going to create, ongoing forever, and how much water are we extracting because of that development, and put a dollar cost on those things. And then maybe at the end of the day, when we look at that and say, you know, somebody's going to make a short-term profit here, but man, look at the cost that's going to come for future generations that have to live with it. And maybe that development isn't such a good idea anymore. And so we can't have unfettered development as much as we want all the time. I hear the governor talk about what a great economy, and we're growing and business is thriving, but eventually with limited resources, you know, something's got to give. And so I'm not anti-development, but I'm development that makes sense, but especially makes sense for our future generations. I don't care about me anymore. I'm old, survived cancer, survived heart issues, but I care about my kids and grandkids' future. Mm-hmm. And what kind of world are we leaving them? So as we inject value systems into our decision making, then I think we have a chance to save the world.
Thank you, Darren.
I love that. I want to just add a little bit. I think Darren's hit it right on. It's like what we really need to do is inject values into our water use equation. So perhaps maybe just to break it down for people, it's around 80%, 70 to 80% of our water in Utah goes to agriculture, 9-10% industry, and 9-10% is municipal use. So human use primarily. I think like 90% of that is outdoor water use, so lawns. So it really is a small piece of the pie that is, individual consumption that is growing as Utah's growing rapidly. So I think that's something in the equation. And then on the agriculture piece, we hear a lot, there's been some pointing fingers at farmers because it's like, oh, 80% of our water is agriculture. Well, let's just stop all of that and, quit growing the things we're growing. There's been a lot of criticism around alfalfa because it's not something that we eat directly. Some of it, not as much as people often think, is being shipped out of the state, out of the country, for big meat and big dairy. Something that I always like to remind people is that these farmers and, the system of agriculture that we're locked into because of our irrigation, because of our water infrastructure, is not driven by us locally. It's driven by these big meat and big dairy industries who really have a lot of control over the federal government. So the agriculture question or piece of the puzzle is a lot bigger than just Utah. And so I think that's something that we need to remember as well.
Thank you, Chandler. Thank you, Darren. I think that we should transition now to thinking about what we need to turn this around. I know each of you at different levels. I consider you all some of the most important leaders working on Great Salt Lake, and I would just love to know your thoughts. What is needed to change? How are we going to get there? Because for me, failure is just not an option, right? We have to succeed. It doesn't matter what the odds are. It doesn't matter how difficult this is. This is our home, right? And our well-being depends on the well-being of the entire environment. So how are we going? Can we frame it that way? How are we going to do this? How are we going to pull this off?
And if I can start, because I need to run in a couple minutes.
Please, Tim.
So I think we've already talked a lot about what we need to do. I mean, it is going to take a cultural change across the entire basin, across Utah, in order for us to change how we use water, how we value it, and that's in our day-to-day use already, and that also as we grow, that's especially important. But it's going to, I think, and I think Sarah and others have said this too, and it's going to take all of us. It's not ag, it's not growth, it's not our communities, municipalities, it's not industrial. It's going to take everyone changing how we use water, how we value it, and then ensuring that we are conserving wherever we can, and then dedicating and delivering that water to the lake every year. And it's not just about times of drought. It's about changing, making that change every year during dry and wet years, and just making sure that something that we used to turn our back to, the lake, we're now turning towards, and we're understanding that it needs to be a critical part of everything that we do, and that all of us do within the Great Salt Lake Basin. So that's kind of where, from the state's perspective and the commissioner's office perspective, that's where we're trying to bring everybody together and identify those specific steps that different industries and groups can take, and how do we facilitate and make sure that water is conserved, dedicated, and delivered to the lake. So not just now, but every year, ongoing, we're looking out 30 years, but we're really trying to figure out how much we can get in the short term to make sure that we've got the lakes stabilized, regardless of whether the drought comes back or not. But the last thing I want to say is, one of the critically important lessons that we've learned when looking at what we need to do for the lake is, wet years are almost more important than dry years, that we need to make sure that we're maximizing when Mother Nature gives us lots of snow, that we're maximizing how much water we get to the lake, and we can get it to the healthy range during those years. So, but I need to leave. So thank you again. And thanks for having me on the panel, and good luck with the rest of the meeting today.
Thank you, Tim. And so really interesting ideas there, but some technical changes that need to be done, but also a change in perspective of turning toward the lake. And Darren, as you mentioned so eloquently, a change of values and of heart. Any other thoughts on what we need to do and how we're going to get it done in time, right? Because it's one thing if we can say, oh yeah, over the next 100 years, or even over the next 30 years, we need to implement these changes. The lake remains right up against the edge when it comes to some of these salinity thresholds and how much of the lake's area, the lake bed is exposed. So what are the changes we need, and how can we get them done in the time that we have?
I have a few thoughts there. And first of all, Ben, I love how you said that failure is not an option. And I wholeheartedly agree. And I like, it's one thing to say, oh, our lake is in such bad shape. But I think the discussion that we're having here today of, well, what can we do? And that's so important. And building on, I know Tim's gone, but building on what he said, I think one of the challenging things is in the past, bringing back to what Darren said, in the past, we'd say, we have a water problem, let's build a dam, or let's create some levees. Like we would try to build our way out, and we would have this single solution. And we know here that that's not going to work, that we're going to need to put everything on the table and conserve water where we can, and maybe take or remove some infrastructure where we can, and think about leaky systems instead of that, where some of that water gets to the Great Salt Lake. And so it's hard because we don't have the just do this one thing and we're going to be okay. Right. And that's a hard place to be for people. And it's going to take changes of behaviors. And COVID taught us all that that's hard. It's like we're wearing masks today, now we're not wearing masks, and it's hard to change our behaviors. And it's really going to come down to that. And the state and the government has a role to maybe incentivize some of that. And, but I think that there are ways forward, and we're going to need to take every option that we can.
Let me just chime in here really quickly. It reminds me of a commercial, well, a public service probably commercial that was shot years ago. I think in the 70s, and you old timers will know this, but Sarah, I don't consider you an old timer, so. But the country had a littering problem, and we didn't really know what to do about it. And it's kind of the same thing. We just had a big problem in America about littering. Well, they ran a commercial that didn't say one word. It was a family screaming down the road in their car, kids in the back seat. And if any of you have kids, they're eating fast food and they're punching each other, just giggling and having a great time, which was probably my kids too. And then they throw their garbage out on the highway, out on the road, and it lands at the feet of a guy that just happens to be standing right there. And the camera slowly pans up to this. Clearly, he's a Native American elder. And he doesn't say a word, but he has a tear running down his cheek. I read a Time magazine article that said that decreased littering in America by like 80%. And you're going, holy cow, a commercial that was run that changed people's perceptions and changed how they do things by 80%. And I thought, I know why. Because when we teach people here and they learn here through art, through music, through storytelling, instead of here, I always forget here. I forget where I park my car when I go to a meeting. But people never forget how they felt when they hear a story, when they've been touched in some way, in an emotional way. And I think that's why I think Native Americans can play a huge role in this. We're storytellers. We transfer values and teach values through storytelling. And I think I'd love to see some public service, commercials that highlight those type of things that really change our perception on, my gosh, look how much lawn I have. Let's turn it into a community garden or something else. And so until we get that, I think we're always going to struggle a little bit. We know we want to do the right thing, and I think all of us do, like Sarah said, but man, sometimes it's like, I'll let my neighbor do that, and I'll keep watering my grass because I don't like brown lawn. But we've got to change behavior. And I think once we change behaviors, and because we want to, we feel a stewardship to, then magic happens. So.
Thank you for those comments. And there are two thoughts that come to me. One is problems that seem impossible to solve. You can have a real state change where it's not a gradual, increase, but it's a step change, right? When there's a change of heart, of perspective. And then the other important point I think that we should mention is the importance of involving Native peoples, right? Native leadership, tribal government in this rescue, which currently is not happening. And so that seems like a really clear, actionable step we could take. So we need advertising, yes. We need cultural change, yes. Have we actually set up the governance structure in a way that's leading toward that kind of deeper change? Because I used to always think about, we get the right policy in place, from a legal political perspective, and then the change trickles down. But more and more, I view it as our policies are a reflection of our values. And if we can get our understanding, our concern for one another, and our whole home, then the policies will follow, right? The right policies will be inevitable at that point.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think something else we need in terms of opening up engagement, making sure that we have more representation, especially from Native communities on decision-making bodies. I think we just need more public engagement generally. I think, in some ways we've gotten into this situation because at least I grew up thinking, oh, we're in a drought. I was very worried about it, but like someone's got to be taking care of it. And I think a lot of us have forgotten our responsibility as to be civically engaged. So I think we just need to, start to include people in the process. The legislature, our decision makers who are dealing with this more than the rest of us, they work part-time and they are also not water policy experts. And so I think it really takes public engagement from academics, really from everyone to come to the table with ideas and to have these open dialogues together so that we can, move towards policies that do align with our values more than we're seeing now.
Something that we're trying to do
go ahead.
that is, a little different, but kind of our science version of this is turning our research projects into more citizen science projects. Because there's one thing that, I'm out there by myself scooping up some sediment, counting the larvae, and then like, okay, that's cool. Here's how many there are. But when people can actually go do it themselves and like get those experiences out of the lake, see what's happening, and then be part of the solution, then we're hoping that it can increase their involvement in other aspects. So we're hoping to add citizen science to our fly project. And one of my colleagues, he is studying the pickleweed, which is on the lake. And it's one of the only plants that can grow in the saline soils that are there, and to kind of see how that can filter out some of the toxins that are there. But hoping to launch that soon. But always hard to do with so many different things going on. But getting people on the ground to bridge that connection between the community and the science that's happening is kind of our way of speaking, or our way of doing what you all have been talking to.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Chandler. And that so many important lessons there. But one thought that comes to mind is even if we agree that this is a people problem, right? Not all of us work in people. Some of us work in science or in programming or a full-time parent. That's definitely a people job. But whatever our job is, how can we actually open it up and turn toward the lake? I think that that's an interesting question for all of us to reflect on as we go away. If you live hundreds or thousands of miles away, there still are things you can do. You know, the state's website is really good, has really good information. There are networks that you can join to support Great Salt Lake, get involved in your local environment. So we need every job to be an environmental job. And that's, of course, going to help us take better care of our home. But I believe that it's also going to address a lot of the mental health issues that we're facing, right? The isolation and loss of purpose and hopelessness. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk so long. Any other thoughts?
I'll just piggyback on that mental health. So a lot of my work through Save Our Great Salt Lake has been the community organizing. And it's, of course, how do we get people involved and come up with the ideas to save the lake? But on the other hand, it's like, this is going to be a long-term effort. And so we think a lot about how do we sustain engagement over the long term, which is not really something we've seen done here on any environmental issue. And so we think about these cultural pieces and ways to bring people in that aren't always the science and the nitty gritty wonky stuff. Like, we're trying to figure out how do we bring in people who don't see themselves as environmental advocates. And so we've leaned into the arts or to just relationship building with the lake. Like, what kind of events can we do where people can come and develop their own relationship with the lake? And I have seen in myself, but in a lot of people, like this, I think Ben's exactly right. We are searching for meaning. I think there's a mental health crisis. A lot of people don't feel like they have purpose or community. And the community that we have seen come together around the lake in just a few short years is like probably the most incredible thing I will ever be a part of. And it really does sustain. It's kind of like this beautiful feedback loop where, this is a crisis. It will continue to be a crisis, but this community is building. We have this space and now these new friendships to work on these things together and also to talk about our grief together and celebrate our wins together. And that, I think, just continues to propel the work forward. So yeah, I love thinking about, of course, the goal is to save the lake, but at the same time, it's like we're building something beautiful, a really great community and giving people a sense of purpose.
Ben, this is Bob coming back in here just to express gratitude for this really wonderful discussion. One of the questions that some people ask is, given the power of the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah, what is the church doing, and what are Latter-day Saints who have a commitment to earth stewardship doing? Is that this is when Brigham Young came there and brought people in the middle of the 19th century and discovered the lake. The church began to have a presence there. What is the church doing now, or is the church doing anything that's centered on the lake?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And we should say discovered the lake, right? There had been people here. In fact, we now know that there were people here before the lake was here, right? There already were native peoples on the shores of Lake Bonneville.
I should have said they discovered the people who first discovered the lake.
There, that's a better way. That's a better way of saying it. But there was a really important address given by one of the presiding bishops in the church, Christopher Waddell, a year ago at the University of Utah. And if you search Waddell, Waddell, Stegner Symposium, it'll come right out. But he announced the church's donation of 20,000 acre feet of water donated in perpetuity to Great Salt Lake. That established the lake's first permanent water right. And then described the church's plan to aggressively conserve water in their direct properties, right, church houses, but also an invitation for members of the church to participate in this watershed-wide lake rescue. So I think that's the best place to go for the overview of the church's actions. But getting back, I'm still thinking about Darren's atomic bomb, and right, the fact that it's not actually a lack of knowledge, scientific knowledge. It's a people problem. There's an interfaith coalition that has come together that's doing really interesting work across all of the faiths in the watershed. There are secular groups that are working together. There are academic groups and government groups that are working together. But I also do want to point out, this doesn't mean that we're going to win, right? And you don't get an A for effort when you're interacting with a big, powerful part of the Earth system. You either come into alignment with those natural laws or you suffer the consequences. And the final question that I had for the panel was, what are the things that give you hope and make you feel like we're moving in the right direction at the right speed? And also, what are the things that bring you fear or anxiety that we aren't? And again, not everybody has to answer both of those, but I would love to know your assessment of that kind of thing.
Let me just begin, and I'll keep it really brief. What gives me hope, and like you said earlier, failure is not an option, so I don't worry about failure. I worry about how close we're going to get to the edge, though, before we have to maybe take drastic steps. The thing that gives me the most hope is to see the youth engaged in the process like never before. 10 years ago, when I was at Standing Rock, the youth taught me a phrase called Ni Mishoni, which means water is life. And what the youth taught me was the promise that of prosperity that this oil pipeline could bring wasn't worth the sacrifice of clean drinking water for all peoples. And so when you look at water as life and you start thinking in those terms, and the youth, I have seen more youth engaged in this cause than ever before. So that's what gives me great amount of hope. And what you do, Ben, with Grow the Flow, and you being such a person that has corralled the youth and giving them direction and guidance, all of it plays a big role. So we need all of it.
Thank you, Darren. And a shout out to the youth. This Saturday, they're holding a Youth Great Salt Lake Summit. I think it begins at 1 p.m. Utah time. So, and I think there is a live stream option. If you go to growtheflowutah.org, there's a calendar there with links to all of the different events that are happening. Thank you, Darren. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question of hope and fear?
I will. I guess what my hope for the lake is how much people care from conversations like this one. And I've been watching the chat, and everyone is so involved and saying really thoughtful comments. And the same applies throughout Utah. Survey after survey, people show that they care about the lake. They're willing to care by visiting the lake, by through activism, by sometimes changing their landscapes. And so I think the people care, the legislature's caring, and all of that to me is so promising. Another aspect that brings me hope is it's much easier to preserve a lake that exists than to try to restore it after it's gone. And we still are in that time where we can preserve it, and we're not like the RLC or Owens Lake or some of the other terminal lakes that are gone. And now we're really just trying to mitigate dust, and we're spending billions of dollars to try to just solve one problem, and we don't have those lakes anymore. So that's another thing that brings me hope. But that also leads me to my fear. My fear is that time is of the essence here. We don't have the luxury of chasing down some really poor solutions. You know, we have to really use this time well so that we don't let 20 years pass and we haven't even a worse lake, and now we're trying to restore it. And so that's my fear, I guess, is that we need to motivate to act quickly and to change our behaviors and our values quickly.
Thank you, Sarah. I heard once a gallon of prevention is worth an acre foot of cure, right? So keep it here. And if we end up in a place where it is severely compromised, then we're just expending energy and resources on making it less bad, rather than on preserving and appreciating and supporting and sustaining this glorious place. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Carly or Chandler?
Yeah. I will say what gives me hope. Well, first of all, I love the way that Rebecca Solnit talks about hope, and I don't have the quote off the top of my head, but it's something about like optimism and pessimism are kind of irrelevant. Hope is more the choice to like act in the direction that you know you have to. So the hope for me is that there will always be an opportunity to improve things and make things better. And I think the time scale that we're working on is certainly very scary, but everything we do is better than not doing it. And so it's just kind of like, let's move in every direction as quickly as we can. And I think, you know, there's so much opportunity, and like I've already touched on a little bit, like, yes, this is about the lake, but I also think all the while what we're building and just this larger call to think more holistically about our relationship to nature, how we manage water, is really going to strengthen our foundations culturally for the long term. What gives me fear? I think, so we've seen more community engagement on this issue than anything we've ever seen in Utah history when it comes to the environment. Extremely exciting. We've not yet figured out how to translate that into policy. I personally think it's just a matter of time. I think democracy is meant to move slowly. But what does give me fear is that we won't figure out the health of our democracy, frankly.
Yeah.
And I would pretty soon want to invite Jim to come in with us. But I wanted to say one thing about just the beauty of what you've been talking about, and tie back into what Darren was saying. Latter-day Saints refer to Utah sometimes as Zion, kind of an unusual use of term, but within the scriptures, Zion has two primary meanings. One is the pure in heart, which ties into the things that Darren and some of you have been talking about. And the other is that they had all things in common. Well, we no longer have all things in common, but there's certainly some things we can have in common. And one of those is the preservation of something so precious and so vital to our future as the Great Salt Lake. I have a dear friend in New Zealand, a scientist by the name of Ray Bradley. Whenever I present a problem to him, he says, Bob, there's only one question you should ever ask in relation to any problem. That's the question I think some of you are asking, and that I think we need to ask together. What is the most loving thing I can do? What is the most loving thing I can do in relation to this precious lake? What is the most loving thing I can do in relation to future generations, as Aaron has talked about, becoming ancestors for those who are coming after us? And so as we all think about the Great Salt Lake, which is given to us as a gift of love from nature, what is the most loving thing we can do individually and collectively? And I just feel that you've taught us today some of the living things that we can do to help preserve this. But Jim, why don't you jump in, and as we get ready for the after chat, add any comments that you think are relevant.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you all. This has been a very stimulating discussion. And I wanted to start with the comment that you made in your opening remarks, Darren, which I think are really seminal to just about every problem that confronts the human race, that it's not about technology. We tend to approach everything with technical fixes. The reality is that it's a human problem. It's a consciousness problem. So I just wanted to underscore, my own sense that that's a fundamental area of certainly what we at Humanity Rising try to delve into is the Einstein's great observation shared by many that the consciousness that produced the problem can't really solve the problem. And how we do that is not so clear in a culture where the very foundation and fabric of the prevailing culture is like you described with Salt Lake in Utah. After, when it was first visited in the 1860s, right, Bob?
That's Ben.
1850s, 1860s. So here we have
Well, the European settlers first arrived
we're in the
early
Europeans,
1800s.
and I demarcate that because those were the ones that proceeded to ruin it. The indigenous for 10,000 years had been getting along, and here it was, as you were saying, Ben, very recently that the church is really even waking up, and it was within the last short period of time where something was actually concretely offered by the prevailing institutions that have destroyed the lake to begin the process of remedying it. And I raise this because in almost all the sessions that we have on Humanity Rising about the environment, it's the same story. Sort of too little, too late by the very people that have produced the problem. And then it's complicated in even a greater way that because of the interactivity of the ecology and the social structures, it's impossible to really solve a specific micro problem, let's say Salt Lake, in isolation with the larger ecological collapses, let's just say, of the western part of the United States. So we're seeing the collapse of the Ogallala Reservoir, which, as you know, undergirds most of the Central West states. And as I understand it from recent discussions on Humanity Rising, it's like more than 90% depleted. In California, where I've been living, you have the great agribusiness industries, which are impervious to lobbying because they control the political process, and they're not willing to moderate any of their behavior. And in the face of water shortages, they just put more chemicals on the crops, which causes a different kind of pollution. So we're in this very complex reality where the local concerns are both impacting and impacted by regional, national, and global deteriorations of the environment. And we have the technologies that can solve it, but not the consciousness or the political will. So that leaves us in a predicament of almost unprecedented proportions, because it's no longer the case that the folks in Utah can even solve the problem without the kind of lateralization that is required. And how do you do that when you can't even get the people in Salt Lake City to stop watering their lawns? So,
Jim, could I respond?
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is not the only concluding thing. This is not like in LA. in San Francisco, in Napa, Sonoma, in California, the situation is replicated over and over, particularly in the industrial nations of North America and Europe. So anyway, yes, I just wanted to kick off a discussion and hear from all of you as to how you respond to this complexity.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the push, but there were a couple of thoughts that came to mind. First, when you describe that complexity, and it's a system of problems, right? And in ecology, we call it a wicked or a super wicked problem. Or actually, my favorite description is a mess. Right? It's a mess.
Put in simple English.
And so it's hard to figure out where to start. But there seems implicit in that description of the complexity that we're doomed to fail. And you said that every Humanity Rising discussion's the same, too little, too late.
No, not that, just to correct, because I think it's important,
Yeah.
not that we're doomed to fail, but going back to the consciousness issue, we have to expand our consciousness proportional to the complexity of the problem.
And I think that often is true and often is not true. And there's a bias, we see the environmental problems, the socio-environmental problems that we don't fix, right? The ones where the collapse happens or where we haven't yet found the solution. Many extremely encouraging successes have been put in place at multiple scales, some of them global, right? Banning of CFCs. And we now see a recovery of the Earth's ozone layer. That happened without a major change in consciousness. Most people don't know that. When I talk to young people now, they don't know it was a problem. They don't know how it was solved, right? So that's one way that a problem can be solved. There also is this global awakening, not only among the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but religions around the world who are taking their environmental stewardship and really putting this at the forefront of their ministries, right? A much more profound, on the ground, person by person, throughout the Earth system, opening of hearts. And so I'm not directly contradicting or saying those things are wrong. I just want to inject in, just because it's complicated in no way takes away the value of our small, incremental, and incomplete efforts and offerings. In fact, it makes them the most important. Because if you think of an analogy, an animal solves a problem with a centralized nervous system, with what we would think of traditionally as a consciousness, right? There's a brain that brings all the data together and then sends the information back out. A plant solves problems that are equally as complex. How to survive predation pressure, how to reproduce, how to find the right place to live, cell by cell, with no centralized system at all. And again, we have there are all these emergent dynamics in the global human population, and even more so when we look at the entire Earth ecosystem, that it's a mix of both of those models, right? And so I never want anyone to fall into that fatalistic place of it's too late and there's no way that we can turn this ship around, because we often, in fact, I'd say we always do the right thing, sometimes after trying everything else, right? But as a last resort, and there's some real resilience there. Didn't mean to talk that long, but any other reactions from the panel?
Those were very good comments. Thank you. Any other responses?
I'll add something. I think certainly you've described the challenge and the complexity of how do we overlay our local issue at the Great Salt Lake with these regional and global systems. That's something that we all need to figure out across the world. But I think something that I love about the Great Salt Lake issue is that it is so local. I think because it's so local, it's more tangible for people. Before I was involved in the lake, I was very worried about climate change with no real understanding of where the inroad was to affect change. And I think the opportunity here is that people are in the place where they can, establish relationships with the decision makers. I think it's much easier for people to affect change at the local level. And we do need to keep that bridge to the regional, global factors. But I think moving forward as a nation, as a globe, like if people can get involved, protecting the places closest to home, that's where we're going to be able to tip the scale and then, of course, connect those movements. But I think having something tangible as we think about the wicked problem of the climate crisis is so important because you can actually see your progress. You can understand what steps you might take.
Mhm. Yeah, beautifully put. Thank you. Any other comments? Then I would ask a question about the relationship between the Mormon church and the indigenous tradition as it comes to ecology. One of the great awarenesses that I think is growing in global consciousness is the unique contribution that the indigenous people have to make at this very critical moment where human survival is on the precipice and we may not make it through. And I think there's a growing awareness that we have a lot to learn from the indigenous peoples at this moment, which requires particularly the Abrahamic religions to exercise a certain humility about the certainties that they've employed for a very long time, and within the context of which they've destroyed the environment. And so I'm just wondering what awareness there is in the Mormon church of the need to really learn from the indigenous traditions, not only about how to live harmoniously with the environment, but the kind of, I would say, metaphysics and spiritual principles that they have employed organically and very naturally for thousands of years, but that somehow we missed in the prevailing Western culture. And I know a little bit more about this conversation and some of the other traditions, but I don't know anything about how the Mormon church and the indigenous people there have interacted and mutually learned from each other.
Let me try to take a stab at that. I'm a sixth generation Shoshone Mormon. So after the Bear River Massacre, which was the massacre of my people, most of the survivors joined the LDS Church in 1873. So I grew up in that religion. And I've been able to, just with my advocacy, meet with many top church leaders over the last few years. And they say the right things, but I still think there's I don't see a lot of movement. But in a lot of my talks I give, I quote Crazy Horse and other chiefs from the 19th century. I think Crazy Horse was a prophet. And I tell the church leaders that. I think he was a prophet. I think he could see our day and time because he had a dream right before he passed away. And his dream and the way he described is absolutely saw our day and time, where we were at as a people, where we are at as an environment. And he made a couple of statements in his dream. He said, upon suffering beyond suffering, the red nation shall rise again, and it will be a blessing to a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separation, a world longing for light again. He goes on to say, I see a time of 7 generations when the whole hoops of the earth will come together and all of mankind will gather under this sacred tree of life. And then here's the meat. He said, in that day, there will be those among my native people who will carry this knowledge. And the young white ones will come to those of my people searching for this wisdom. And then he closes his dream with some things, but I think we live in a sick world. I think we live in a world that's searching for light again. And I think there's this indigenous knowledge that's still here, this ecological tribal knowledge that's been developed over thousands of years, how to steward the land. And I think it's here. And in many of my talks I give, I go, we have it. Come ask for it. Let's partner together. Let's do this.
Mhm.
Because I think there's many things that we can learn from each other. And I think that traditional wisdom can solve many of our problems that we have today. The church is real gracious to meet with me, and they've hired an environmental specialist. I sat on a panel with her last week. I don't think she has a lot of power and authority to affect change. And I certainly hope the church takes a bigger role and step going forward. I think if you were to read the Book of Mormon, it was written for the Native American people. And I think the Native Americans play a prominent role in their religion, according to them in their book. So who better to get advice from is these old chiefs that are having these dreams in the 18th century about our day and time. And so I think there's some real value and stuff, but I think the change from the church is slow coming, although they're making bigger steps than they've had in a long time. I think they need to make bigger ones. And I hope they do so going forward.
Thank you.
And maybe we all need to make bigger ones and smaller ones in love.
Yeah, when we're all under duress, it's time to hold hands. And I think we've gotten to that point where new ways of thinking, as you've been indicating, and new ways of working together are essential to ensure certainly the remediation of the Great Salt Lake, but most human problems.
Yeah, I've said this many times. I've said that when you assume that scientific knowledge is superior to indigenous wisdom, you make collaboration impossible. And look, I think that's what it's going to take going forward, is
Well put.
collaboration on many different levels, many different groups that all do their own thing, coming together to solve a problem that affects all of us.
I think that's a nice final word for our session. Thank you all for the heartfulness. I want to just end by acknowledging all of your heartfulness. You're obviously very passionate about this, and I have no doubt, to your point, Ben, I have no doubt you're going to succeed. That's clear from this panel. And so I really appreciate it. And I think I'm feeling inspired, and I know our community is. And so thank you all for what you're doing. And maybe sometime next year you can come back on, Bob, with this group and give us an update and report on the successes achieved and the challenges met. So thank you all.
Right.
So that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You'll find the chat, the after chat link in the chat box. A number of the panelists are going to be able to join, and then we will see you tomorrow for a fascinating discussion of the intelligence and empathetic qualities of water. The more they're finding out about water, the more they're realizing it is an intelligence and a healing medium that is almost miraculous when you really plumb the depths of H2O. So that's tomorrow on Humanity Rising. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jim.
You in the after chat. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.